Henry was a lucky guy, there was no doubt about that. He had everything a man could want: a huge mansion, luxury cars, designer clothes, and a bank account with many zeros. At 45 years old, Henry had reached the top, becoming one of the richest men in the country. But behind this facade of success and wealth, Henry carried a heavy burden. A few years ago, his only daughter, little Sophia, had died in a terrible car accident. The pain of the loss was overwhelming, and Henry was never the same after that. "I lost everything when I lost my girl," he would often say with teary eyes, reminiscing about the happy moments he had with his daughter. "I have everything, except what really matters." Since that fateful day, Henry had buried himself in work, avoiding thinking about the pain he felt. He isolated himself from the world, pushing away any possibility of creating new emotional connections. His life boiled down to making more money and trying, unsuccessfully, to fill the enormous void left by Sophia's death. But deep down, Henry knew he needed to find a new purpose, a new reason to live. And it was in this moment of reflection that he decided to visit a local orphanage, in the hope of being able to do something good and, who knows, find a little solace for his shattered soul. After a few weeks pondering the idea, Henry finally mustered the courage and decided to visit the Morning Star Orphanage, located just a few miles from his mansion. He knew he needed to do something to fill the void he felt, and helping those abandoned children seemed to be a good way to start. When Henry arrived at the orphanage, he was greeted by a friendly social worker named Marcia. "Welcome, Mr. Henry. I'm so glad you've come to visit us today," Marcia said with a sincere smile. "Hello, Marcia. I've heard about the good work you do here, and I decided it was time to lend a hand," Henry replied, trying to sound upbeat, despite the sadness he still carried. Marcia then invited Henry to tour the facilities and meet some of the children. As he walked through the hallways, the millionaire could hear the laughter and joyful shouts of the children playing in the yard. "As you can see, Mr. Henry, this place is full of life and happiness. These children really need love and attention. Any help you can provide will be very welcome," Marcia said, with a tone of hope in her voice. Henry nodded, feeling a pang in his chest as he remembered his own daughter. "I can imagine that. I'd like to meet some of them, if possible." Marcia readily agreed, and the two headed towards the yard, where the children were playing enthusiastically. That's when Henry saw a little boy holding a plush teddy bear that was very familiar to him. As he approached the yard, Henry soon spotted a little boy sitting in a corner, hugging a brown plush teddy bear. That teddy bear was identical to the one his daughter Sophia had adored when she was little. He could remember the toy perfectly, as it was always with her. But how can this be? Henry asked himself, feeling a wave of emotions rush through his chest. His heart raced, and a sense of nostalgia and pain took over him. Marcia, noticing Henry's fixed gaze on the little boy, decided to approach. "Oh, I see you've noticed Pedro. He's one of our most beloved boys here at the orphanage," Marcia said, smiling. Henry couldn't take his eyes off the teddy bear. "That bear. It's identical to the one my daughter had when she was little." Marcia looked at the teddy bear and then at Henry, noticing the distressed expression on his face. "Ah, I see. It must have brought back memories, hasn't it? Pedro received this bear from a donation we recently received." Henry couldn't hold back the emotion that was overwhelming him. That teddy bear was a connection to his beloved daughter, who had died years ago. And seeing it in the hands of that little boy made him relive all the pain and longing he felt. Without thinking, Henry approached Pedro and, with desperate urgency, shouted, "Where did you get this? This bear is not yours. Give it back." Everyone in the yard stopped what they were doing, shocked by the millionaire's unexpected reaction. Henry's scream echoed through the yard, startling the children and leaving everyone present with their mouths agape. Pedro clung to the teddy bear tightly, his eyes wide with fear in the face of the man's violent reaction. "Calm down, Mr. Henry. What's happening?" Marcia said, rushing to stand between Henry and Pedro, trying to calm the situation. But Henry couldn't control himself. His eyes were welling up, and his chest was rising and falling rapidly, as if he could barely breathe. "That bear! That damn bear!" he yelled, pointing to the toy in Pedro's hands. "It's identical to the one my daughter had. How did you get this?" The other children shrank back, frightened by the man's behavior. Pedro, in turn, hugged the teddy bear even tighter, his tears beginning to stream down his face. Marcia tried to hold Henry by the shoulders, in a comforting gesture. "Mr. Henry, please, calm down. This teddy bear was recently donated, but I don't understand why you're so upset." Henry shook his head, his eyes fixed on the teddy bear. That bear was my daughter's. She loved that toy with all her heart. And now, seeing it here, in the hands of a stranger child. It's too much for me." The millionaire covered his face with his hands, his body trembling with sobs. All those present were silent, shocked by Henry's intense emotional reaction. After the initial shock, Henry managed to calm down a bit. He knew he needed to understand how that so familiar teddy bear had ended up in Pedro's hands at the orphanage. It couldn't be a simple coincidence. "Marcia, please, I need to know more about this teddy bear. Where did it come from?" Henry asked, still visibly shaken. The social worker noticed the urgency in the millionaire's voice and decided to explain everything she knew. "Well, Mr. Henry, this teddy bear is part of a donation we recently received from a charity organization. They sent us a box of various used toys and clothes to be distributed among the children at the orphanage." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "And do you know the name of that charity organization?" "Let me see." Marcia answered, scratching her head. "Ah, yes. If I'm not mistaken, it was the Hope Foundation." Hearing that name, Henry felt a shiver run down his spine. The Hope Foundation was exactly the institution that had received his daughter's belongings after the accident. He remembered very well having donated all of Sophia's things to that organization, in the hope that they could help other children. "It can't be," Henry murmured, his face pale as wax. Marcia noticed the millionaire's reaction and grew concerned. "Do you know this organization, Mr. Henry?" Henry took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself to reveal a truth he had buried in the past. "Yes, I know this foundation very well. It received all of my daughter's things, after the accident." The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in Henry's mind. Somehow, that teddy bear, so important to his daughter, had come back to him through that donation. It was as if the universe was giving him a sign, a link to the past. Determined to uncover the truth, Henry approached Pedro, firmly grasping the young boy's shoulder. "My son, I need you to tell me everything you know about this teddy bear." Henry was silent for a few moments, his mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. Then he turned to Marcia again, determination etched on his face. "Marcia, I need to know more about this Hope Foundation. Can you give me more details?" The social worker nodded, sensing the urgency in Henry's voice. "Of course, Mr. Henry. The Hope Foundation is a highly respected charity organization in the city. They do incredible work, collecting donations of clothes, toys, and other items to distribute among underprivileged children in orphanages like ours." Henry listened attentively, feeling his heart beating faster and faster. And you said this teddy bear is part of a recent donation from the Hope Foundation, right? Yes, that's right. They sent us a box full of toys, clothes, and other items that they had received from donors. And this teddy bear was among them. Marcia observed Henry's thoughtful expression and decided to ask. Do you know this institution, Mr. Henry? You seem so intrigued by this story about the teddy bear. Henry nodded slowly, his voice almost a whisper. Yes, Marcia. I know the Hope Foundation very well. They were the institution that received my daughter's belongings after the accident. Marcia's eyes widened, understanding the importance of that revelation. So this teddy bear belonged to your daughter? She asked, incredulous. Henry felt a lump form in his throat, the memories of the past mingling with the pain of the present. Yes. This teddy bear was my little Sophia's favorite toy. She never parted with it. Marcia brought her hands to her mouth, shocked by the coincidence. My God. So, somehow, this teddy bear has come back to you, through this donation. It's truly a miracle. Henry nodded, his eyes shining with restrained tears. Yes, Marcia. And now I need to understand how this was possible. This teddy bear is the only connection I have left to my daughter. After discovering the connection between the plush teddy bear and the memory of his deceased daughter, Henry couldn't take his eyes off the little Pedro. The boy, who had previously seemed so distracted and quiet, now had the millionaire's full attention. Henry approached Pedro, who was still clutching the teddy bear tightly, his eyes frightened. Hey, kid, can you tell me how you got this teddy bear? Henry asked, trying to sound as gentle as possible. Pedro lowered his gaze, seeming intimidated by the man's presence. It was donated to us. They said it was from a girl who's no longer here, the little boy replied, his voice trembling. Henry felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing those words. He could imagine the pain that child had already faced in his short life. I see. And you really like this teddy bear, don't you? Henry asked, his voice soft. Pedro nodded, hugging the toy affectionately. Yes, sir. It's very special to me. It's the only toy I have. Henry observed the boy closely, noticing his sad and lonely expression. He knew very well what it was like to carry the weight of losing a loved one. You know, this teddy bear belonged to my daughter. Henry revealed, his voice laden with emotion. Pedro looked up, surprised, and then shook his head in negation. No, sir. I didn't know that. Henry nodded, feeling a pang of pain as he remembered his beloved Sophia. Well, my son. This teddy bear was her favorite toy. She loved that bear with all her heart. A tense silence fell between them, as Henry observed Pedro attentively, his mind working a mile a minute. There was a connection between that little boy and his daughter, something he needed to understand better. Determined to unravel this mystery, Henry placed his hand on Pedro's shoulder, his gaze full of empathy. Boy, you have a story, don't you? A story of loss, just like mine. Pedro nodded slowly, his eyes welling up, and Henry knew at that moment that his life was about to change forever. Henry could see the pain in the little boy's eyes, a pain he knew all too well. He knew that teddy bear represented much more than just a toy for Pedro. So, you've also been through a tragedy, haven't you, my son? Henry asked, his voice full of understanding. Pedro nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. Yes, sir. I lost my parents in a car accident, a few years ago, the boy revealed, his voice choked with emotion. Henry felt a shiver run through his body. The similarities between Pedro's story and his own daughter's were frightening. "Oh, my God. I'm so sorry, my son. I know exactly how you feel," Henry said, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder in a comforting gesture. Pedro looked up, surprised by the man's empathy. You've also lost someone, sir." Henry nodded, his gaze laden with pain. "Yes, Pedro. I lost my daughter, Sophia, in a car accident. She was the most precious thing in my life." Tears streamed down Henry's face, and Pedro watched him, his eyes wide. "So, you know how much it hurts to lose someone so important?" the little boy asked, his voice trembling. Henry pulled Pedro into a tight hug, feeling the pain of that child as if it were his own. "Yes, my son. I know exactly how you feel. The pain of loss is something that will mark our lives forever." Pedro snuggled into the embrace, finally letting his tears flow freely. Henry, in turn, cried in silence, his soul connecting with the sorrow of that boy. In that moment, they were not just a rich man and a little orphan boy. They were two wounded souls, meeting to share the same sadness and, perhaps, find a bit of comfort in one another. Embraced, Henry and Pedro remained silent for a few moments, tears streaming down both their faces. That moment seemed to transcend the social barriers that separated them, the millionaire and the orphanage boy united by the pain of loss and loneliness. Gradually, Henry pulled away from the hug, his eyes finding Pedro's. There was a deep connection between them, a mutual understanding that went beyond words. "Pedro, I know that nothing I say can ease your pain," Henry said, his voice soft. "But I want you to know that you're not alone. I understand exactly what you're going through." The little boy nodded, wiping the tears with the back of his hand. "It's so hard, sir. I miss my parents every day. They were everything to me." Henry felt his heart break upon hearing those words. He could see himself reflected in that boy, carrying the same burden of loss. "I know, my son. The pain of loss is something that never completely leaves us. But with time, it becomes a little lighter." Pedro looked at him, his eyes pleading for comfort. Do you think I'll be able to be happy again someday?" Henry held Pedro's hands between his own, his gaze full of empathy. "Yes, Pedro. I believe you will. You are such a strong and courageous child. I know you will find happiness again." A small smile blossomed on Pedro's lips, and Henry felt his heart warm. That boy was awakening in him a feeling he thought he had lost forever. "Thank you, sir. I liked you," Pedro said, shyly. Henry nodded, feeling a deep connection form between them. "And I liked you very much too, my son. And I want you to know that from today on, you will no longer be alone." In that moment, Henry knew his life had taken a new turn. He was ready to open up again, to love and be loved. And it all started with that little boy, who carried the same burden of pain that he had carried for so long. After that emotional day at the orphanage, Henry found it impossible to forget the little Pedro. The connection that had formed between them, united by the pain of loss, was something the millionaire couldn't simply ignore. In the days that followed, Henry made sure to return to the orphanage several times, always finding a way to spend some time with the little boy. "Hello, Pedro. I brought some things for you today," Henry would say, as he entered the orphanage, his face lit up by a smile. Pedro, who had previously seemed so shy and apprehensive, now ran towards Henry, his eyes shining with joy. "Mr. Henry. You came back. the boy exclaimed, hugging the millionaire with enthusiasm. Henry returned the hug with affection, feeling his heart warm with each encounter. "Of course I came back, my son. I promised I wouldn't leave you alone anymore, remember?" he would say, while ruffling Pedro's hair with care. During these visits, Henry made an effort to provide Pedro with moments of fun and relaxation. They played together in the yard, played games, and Henry even brought treats for the little boy. "Wow, you brought chocolate cake. My favorite!" Pedro would exclaim, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Henry would smile, happy to see the boy so animated. "I know, my friend. I remembered you loved this cake when I came last time." Pedro would devour the cake with enthusiasm, his expression one of pure delight. Henry would watch him, feeling a wave of affection and protection wash over him. During these visits, the bond between them grew stronger and stronger. Henry would listen patiently to Pedro's stories, console his sorrows, and encourage him to dream of a better future. And with each encounter, Henry felt his own pain dissipate a little more. Being by Pedro's side gave him a new reason to live, a chance to rebuild the happiness he had lost. Before meeting Pedro, Henry's routine was extremely predictable and lonely. Wake up, go to the office, come home, and repeat the cycle. His life revolved around work and accumulating more wealth, a futile attempt to fill the void left by the death of his daughter Sophia. But all that began to change after Henry met the little Pedro at the orphanage. The boy brought new color and life to the millionaire's monotonous existence. "I'm leaving the office early today," Henry told his assistant as he gathered his belongings. "I need to stop by the orphanage to visit Pedro." The assistant looked at Henry, surprised. It was the first time in years that the boss had shown interest in anything beyond work. "The orphanage, sir." "Very well, I'll make a note of that," he responded discreetly. When Henry arrived at the orphanage, his face lit up with a genuine smile. He would run through the yard, searching for Pedro, and when he found him, the two would spend hours playing and talking. "Come on, Pedro. Let's play that board game you like so much," Henry would say, excited. Pedro would smile from ear to ear, delighted by the company of his new friend. "Really, Mr. Henry? You're going to play with me?" "Of course, my son. I love spending time with you," Henry would reply, pulling the boy by the hand. Gradually, Pedro's presence transformed Henry's life. He began to worry less about work and dedicate more time to visiting the orphanage. His conversations with Pedro became the highlight of his day, and he would catch himself smiling alone, reminiscing about the moments they spent together. Marcia, the social worker, observed this change with admiration. "Mr. Henry, I'm so glad to see how dedicated you've been to Pedro. He seems so happy with your company." Henry nodded, his gaze filled with affection. "He does me so much good, Marcia. This child has returned the joy I had lost for so long." And for the first time in years, Henry felt that his life had a purpose again. It was no longer just about accumulating wealth, but about building a meaningful connection and bringing happiness to someone. After spending so much time with Pedro and witnessing the transformation the little boy had brought to his lonely life, Henry began to envision a future very different from what he had imagined. Sitting in his office, Henry would find himself lost in thought, imagining what it would be like to have Pedro in his life permanently. Could I adopt him? He would question himself, his heart racing with the possibility. Henry knew this would not be an easy decision. After all, he had already lost a daughter, and the pain of that loss was still very present in his life. But at the same time, the idea of having the chance to raise and care for Pedro filled him with a hope he thought he had lost forever. One afternoon, during one of his visits to the orphanage, Henry gathered the courage to broach the subject with Marcia. "Marcia, I've been thinking a lot about Pedro. And I think I'd like to adopt him," he said, his voice trembling. The social worker's eyes widened, surprised by the revelation. "Adopt him, Mr. Henry? That's a really big decision." Henry nodded, his gaze determined. "I know, Marcia. But this child, he's brought me a joy I haven't felt in a long time. I want to be able to take care of him, give him a real home." Marcia observed the sincerity in Henry's expression, and slowly, a smile spread across her face. "Well, if that's your wish, Mr. Henry, I'll do everything I can to expedite the adoption process." Henry felt a sense of relief wash over him. Finally, he could make that dream that had been haunting him in the last few days a reality. "Thank you so much, Marcia. I don't know what to say. This chance to start over is all I need." Marcia placed her hand on Henry's shoulder, her eyes shining with emotion. "You don't need to say anything, Mr. Henry. I can see how much Pedro already means to you. And I'm sure this union will bring so much happiness to both of you." Henry nodded, his gaze turning to where Pedro was playing in the yard. Yes, that boy had the power to transform his life for the better. And he was ready to open himself up to this new opportunity, no matter how daunting it might seem. When Henry shared his plans to adopt Pedro with the little boy, the child's reaction was not exactly what the millionaire had expected. Pedro listened in silence, his eyes wide and his body tense. After a few moments, he shook his head, vehemently denying. "No, Mr. Henry. I don't want to be adopted," Pedro exclaimed, his voice trembling. Henry was surprised by the boy's reaction, but tried to remain calm. "But, Pedro, I thought you liked me. I want to take care of you, be your father," Henry said, placing his hand on the little boy's shoulder. Pedro took a step back, distancing himself from Henry. "No. You can't be my father. My parents are my dad and mom, and they're gone," the boy shouted, tears streaming down his face. Marcia, who was witnessing the scene, approached Pedro, trying to calm him down. "Calm down, Pedro. Mr. Henry just wants to give you a home, a family." But Pedro shook his head, stubborn. "No, I don't want to. I don't want another father. I want my parents back," the boy sobbed. Henry felt his heart break at the sight of the pain etched on Pedro's face. He knew that the loss of his parents had left deep scars on that child. "Pedro, I understand your pain. I've also lost someone very important. But I promise I'll take care of you, be a real father to you," Henry said, his voice gentle. However, Pedro continued to reject the idea, retreating further and further. "No. You can't be my father. I don't want to," the little boy shouted, running towards his room and slamming the door. Henry stood there, watching the door close, his chest tight with the pain of rejection. He knew that earning Pedro's trust would be a great challenge, but he was determined not to give up. After the initial harsh rejection from Pedro, Henry knew he needed to act with great care and patience to win the boy's trust. He perfectly understood the pain and fear Pedro felt about having a new father. In the days that followed, Henry made sure to visit the orphanage even more often, always bringing gifts and playing with Pedro. But whenever the topic of adoption was mentioned, the boy would close up again and refuse the idea. "Hey, Pedro, I brought that board game you like so much. Want to play together?" Henry would say, with a kind smile. Pedro would look suspicious, but couldn't deny the invitation. Gradually, he would surrender to Henry's company and allow the distrust to give way to a closer relationship. "Okay, Mr. Henry. Let's play," the boy would respond, still a bit reserved. During the moments of play and conversation, Henry always made sure to demonstrate his genuine affection and concern for Pedro. He listened attentively to the boy's stories and dreams, always seeking ways to support and encourage him. "You know, Pedro, I have a dream of taking you to an amusement park. Have you ever been to one?" Henry would ask, his eyes shining with excitement. Pedro would shake his head slowly, his eyes lighting up with the possibility. "No, Mr. Henry. I've never been to an amusement park." "Well, when you're ready, I'll take you. It's going to be an incredible adventure, I promise," Henry would say, with an encouraging smile. Gradually, Pedro's resistance began to give way. He realized that Henry was different from all the other adults who had passed through his life. The millionaire showed genuine concern and affection, something Pedro was not used to receiving. During one of the visits, when Henry mentioned the possibility of adoption again, Pedro did not react with the same vehemence as before. "I know you still have doubts, Pedro. But I want you to know that I'll never force you into anything. I just want to give you a home, a place where you can be happy," Henry said, his voice calm and understanding. Pedro observed Henry in silence for a few moments, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. I need time to think, Mr. Henry," the boy responded, his voice almost a whisper. Henry nodded, placing his hand on Pedro's shoulder in a gesture of affection. "Okay, my son. I understand. I'll be here, waiting for you." In that moment, Henry knew that, little by little, he was earning Pedro's trust. And he was determined not to give up, no matter how long it took. After weeks of constant visits and building a relationship of trust with Pedro, Henry made a firm decision: he would adopt the boy. No matter how scary or challenging it might be, Henry knew that Pedro's presence in his life had become indispensable. One day, during one of his visits, Henry called Pedro to talk in a secluded corner of the orphanage. "Pedro, I know you're still unsure about the idea of me being your new father. And I understand that perfectly," Henry began, his voice serene. Pedro watched Henry attentively, still a bit distrustful. "Yes, Mr. Henry. I'm still afraid," the boy admitted, lowering his gaze. Henry nodded, understanding. "I know, my son. And I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to know that if you give me a chance, I'll take care of you with all my heart." Pedro looked up, surprised by the statement. You still want to adopt me, Mr. Henry?" Henry smiled, holding Pedro's hands between his own. "Yes, Pedro. I've decided that I want to be your father. I want to give you a home, a family. I want to be able to take care of you and see you grow up happy." Tears welled up in Pedro's eyes, and Henry could see the hope blossoming in that gaze. "But what if I can't love you the way I loved my parents?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Henry felt his heart tighten. He knew that the pain of loss still weighed heavily on Pedro. "My son, I don't expect you to love me the same way. I know that no one can take the place of your parents. But I want you to give me a chance to be someone special in your life, someone who will support you and love you unconditionally." Pedro remained silent for a few moments, his mind working to process those words. Finally, a small smile blossomed on his lips. So you really want to be my father?" Henry nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "More than anything, Pedro. I want to have the honor of being your father." Without hesitation, Pedro threw himself into Henry's arms, hugging him tightly. And there, in that moment, Henry knew that his life had gained a new meaning. He had found a second chance at happiness, and this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. As soon as Henry received Pedro's acceptance to become his son, the millionaire sprang into action to begin the adoption process. He knew it would be a long and bureaucratic journey, but he spared no effort to do everything correctly. First, Henry scheduled a meeting with Marcia, the orphanage's social worker. "Marcia, I've made my decision. I want to adopt Pedro," Henry said, his voice firm and determined. Marcia smiled, visibly emotional. "I'm so glad to hear that, Mr. Henry. I'll take care of all the necessary documents to start the process." Henry nodded, eager for everything to go well. "Of course, Marcia. I want to do this the right way, within the rules. I'm willing to cooperate with you in whatever is needed." The social worker was already making notes in her agenda. "Great. We'll need a psychological evaluation of you, a visit to the orphanage to assess the interaction between you and Pedro, and some other bureaucratic procedures." Henry listened attentively, knowing that this journey would not be easy. But he was determined not to give up. "I'll do whatever is necessary. I want this process to be as fast as possible." In the following days, Henry went through all the steps of the adoption process. He did interviews, filled out forms, presented documents, and even underwent a psychological evaluation. During one of the visits to the orphanage, Marcia observed the interaction between Henry and Pedro with a smile on her face. "You know, Mr. Henry, I can see how much you've already connected. This adoption will be a blessing for Pedro." Henry caressed the boy's hair, who was playing by his side. "I hope so, Marcia. This boy has already become so important to me. I just want to be able to give him the home and family he deserves." After weeks of bureaucracy and anxiety, Henry finally received the news he had been waiting for: Pedro's adoption had been approved. With a radiant smile, he rushed to share the good news with his son. "Pedro, my son. We did it. The adoption is finalized." Tears of joy streamed down the boy's face, and he threw himself into Henry's arms, finally finding the home he had been longing for. After weeks of bureaucratic procedures, evaluations, and anxiety, the big day had arrived. Henry's adoption of Pedro had been approved and finalized. When Henry received the news, he couldn't contain his emotion. Finally, that boy who had entered his life in such an unexpected and transformative way would become his true son. "Pedro, my son. We did it!" Henry exclaimed, with tears in his eyes, as he found the boy at the orphanage. Pedro could hardly believe it. His eyes sparkled with joy, and without hesitation, he threw himself into Henry's arms, in a tight embrace. "Dad, are you really my father now?" Pedro asked, his voice choked with emotion. Henry nodded, holding the boy close to his chest. "Yes, my son. You're mine now, forever. I love you so much." Tears streamed down both their faces, but they were tears of happiness. After so much suffering and loss, they finally had the chance to build a family together. Marcia observed the scene, her heart brimming with joy. "Congratulations, Mr. Henry. I knew this adoption would be something very special," the social worker said, with a smile. Henry looked at Marcia, his face radiant. "Thank you, Marcia. I don't have words to describe how much this means to me. This boy has completely changed my life." Pedro lifted his face, his eyes shining. "So, can we go for walks? And to the amusement park? the boy asked, excited. Henry smiled, affectionately ruffling Pedro's hair. Of course, my son. We'll do whatever you want. Your happiness is my priority now. Embraced, father and son celebrated that special moment. Henry knew that from that day on, his life would have a new purpose, to create a home full of love and opportunities for his little boy. And Pedro, in turn, had finally found the security and affection he had longed for. The man who was once a stranger would now be his father forever. After all the bureaucracy and waiting, Henry was finally able to take Pedro to his vast mansion, which would now be the little boy's home. Upon arrival, Pedro was enchanted by the grandeur of the house, his eyes shining with admiration. Wow, Dad! Is this your house? It's huge! The boy exclaimed, rushing from one room to the other. Henry smiled, following Pedro's excited steps. Yes, my son. Now this is also your home. And I want you to feel completely at ease here. Pedro suddenly stopped, his face reflecting a slight concern. But what if I break something? Or if I get lost in this big house? The boy asked, fearfully. Henry crouched down, bringing himself to Pedro's level, and caressed his face affectionately. Don't worry, Pedro. I'll be here to take care of you. And you can explore the house as much as you want, without fear of breaking anything. The boy nodded, a little more at ease, and soon returned to running around, marveling at the details of the residence. In the first few days, Henry and Pedro had to adjust to the new routine. The millionaire, accustomed to his lonely and rigid life, had to learn to give more attention and affection to his adopted son. Dad, can you read me a bedtime story? Pedro would ask, already in his pajamas, his eyes pleading. Henry would smile, setting aside the papers from the office to attend to the boy's request. Of course, my son. Come, let's choose a good one. And there, lying in bed, Henry would read the story enthusiastically, caressing Pedro's hair until the boy succumbed to sleep. Some nights, however, were not so peaceful. Pedro still had nightmares and crying spells, recalling the loss of his biological parents. Sho, it's okay, my love. I'm here, Henry would say, rocking the boy in his arms until the tears subsided. In these moments, Henry felt his heart break, but he knew he needed to be strong and provide all the support Pedro needed. Gradually, father and son were getting used to each other, discovering each other's habits, tastes, and needs. And despite the initial challenges, Henry felt his heart fill with joy at each new smile from Pedro. I love you, Dad, the boy would say, before falling asleep, snuggled in Henry's protective embrace. And Henry knew that at that moment, his life had found a new meaning. He had a son to care for, love, and guide. And that was all he needed. In the months that followed the adoption of Pedro, Henry experienced a profound transformation in his life. That lonely man, dedicated only to the accumulation of wealth, gradually became a loving and attentive father, focused on providing his adopted son with all the happiness and opportunities he deserved. Come on, Pedro. Today's the day we're going to the amusement park, remember? Henry would say, enthusiastically, as he helped the boy get ready. Pedro would smile from ear to ear, his features radiant. Really, Dad? We're finally going. How cool! The boy would exclaim, jumping excitedly. Henry watched Pedro's joy with a full heart. This was the kind of moment he had lost with the death of his daughter Sophia. And now, he had the chance to relive this experience, this time as a father. During the visits to the park, Henry would play with Pedro without worrying about his own image. He would slide down the rides, eat cotton candy, and take photos with the boy, his eyes shining with happiness. "Dad, you're the best," Pedro would say, giving Henry a big hug after each adventure. And Henry returned the hug with all the affection, feeling his heart warm with those words. For the first time in years, he felt complete and fulfilled. On weekends, Henry would take Pedro to discover new places, from museums to theme parks. He wanted to provide the boy with all the experiences a child deserves to have. "Look, Pedro, this is the Science Museum. You're going to love seeing all those incredible inventions," Henry would say, already pulling the boy by the hand. Pedro would observe everything with wide eyes, fascinated. "Wow, Dad. I want to see everything, can I?" the boy would ask, eagerly. And Henry, with a radiant smile, would readily agree, happy to see his son's curiosity and enthusiasm. Gradually, Henry's lonely and monotonous life gave way to an existence full of meaning and purpose. He had found a new reason to live, a chance to rebuild the happiness he had lost with Sophia's death. And with every moment shared with Pedro, Henry felt the emptiness in his heart being filled. That boy had become his family, his salvation. "I love you, my son," Henry would whisper, as he watched Pedro sleep peacefully, snuggled in his embrace. And in that moment, Henry knew he had found his redemption. His life had gained a new luster, thanks to that little boy he now called son. After months of coexistence and bond building, Henry and Pedro had become inseparable. The plush teddy bear, which had once been the link between them, now occupied a special place in the heart of both. One afternoon, Henry found Pedro hugging the toy, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Pedro, my son, is everything all right?" Henry asked, sitting down next to the boy. Pedro looked up, a small smile blossoming on his lips. "Yes, Dad. I was just remembering my mom. She gave me this teddy bear when I was a baby." Henry felt his heart tighten at those words. He knew how special that toy was to Pedro. "I can imagine how special this teddy bear must be to you, my son. It holds so many memories of your mother." Pedro nodded, caressing the toy affectionately. "Yeah, Dad. I miss them so much. But now I have you." Henry pulled Pedro into a tight hug, his eyes welling up. "And you'll always have me, my love. I'll take care of you and love you as if you were my own son." The two sat there, embraced, sharing the pain of loss, but also the hope of a new family. After that day, the plush teddy bear took on an even more special place in the lives of Henry and Pedro. Whenever they felt the longing for their loved ones, they would hug it, finding comfort and strength in each other. And gradually, the pain transformed into gratitude and joy. Henry had found, in that little boy, the chance to rebuild his own life and give Pedro the home and love he so desperately needed. "I love you, my son. Thank you so much for coming into my life," Henry would say, as he played with Pedro in the mansion's garden. Pedro would smile, his eyes shining with happiness. "I love you too, Dad. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." In that moment, Henry knew his life had found a new purpose. He was no longer just a rich and lonely man. Now, he was a father, someone who had the chance to provide a child with everything he himself had lost. And together, Henry and Pedro would build a new story, uniting their past's pains with a hope for a bright future, filled with love and fulfillment. That plush teddy bear would be the eternal symbol of this deep and meaningful connection.